Racist cop arrests wealthy black teen father's response shocks everyone. Blue and red lights flash across the midnight black Mercedes S-Class, reflecting off the polished hood as a 17-year-old honor student grips the steering wheel, his heart pounding. Just minutes earlier, he'd been driving home from volleyball practice, his varsity leather jacket still damp with sweat. Now, he finds himself surrounded by 3 patrol cars on a quiet suburban street, watching officers approach with hands on their weapons. What happened next would spark outrage across social media and news channels nationwide. But it's not the incident itself that would leave millions of viewers speechless, it's what unfolded in its aftermath, when a father chose to respond in a way that challenged everything we think we know about justice, forgiveness, and the power of breaking cycles. This is the story of how one traffic stop in an upscale neighborhood outside Atlanta turned into a defining moment that forced an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths. The high school senior, bound for Stanford University on a full academic scholarship, had never had a brush with law enforcement before. His father, a prominent cardiothoracic surgeon, had spent 20 years building respect in the medical community and establishing their family as pillars of local society. As cell phone footage from a neighbor's camera began to circulate online, showing the teenager being ordered out of his car and handcuffed despite his calm compliance. The familiar pattern of public anger and calls for justice emerged. Cable news networks picked up the story. Hashtags trended. Protests were planned. But then something unexpected happened, something that would challenge assumptions on all sides of the debate. The father's response, delivered first in a closed-door meeting with police leadership and later in a viral video that reached millions, wasn't what anyone predicted. It wasn't filled with rage, though he had every right to be angry. It wasn't a call for heads to roll, though accountability was clearly needed. Instead, his words and actions set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just one police department, but reshape how an entire community thought about healing deep-seated wounds. As we dive into this story, you'll hear first-hand accounts from everyone involved: the teenager who kept his composure even as his future seemed to hang in the balance, the neighbor who caught it all on camera, the police officers whose assumptions were forced into the light, and the father whose extraordinary choice would echo far beyond that single night. You'll see raw footage that hasn't been shown before, and learn what happened in the crucial moments that weren't caught on any camera. But before we reveal how this story ends, you need to understand how it began. Take yourself back to that warm spring evening, when a young man's drive home from practice turned into a test of character that nobody should have to face. Picture yourself behind that wheel, watching those patrol car lights flash brighter in your mirrors, knowing that the next few minutes could change everything, not just for one family, but for an entire community searching for a way forward. This is a story about more than just one traffic stop gone wrong. It's about what happens when we're faced with the choice between reacting the way the world expects us to, and finding the courage to break free from those expectations. It's about a father and son whose response to injustice would challenge everyone's assumptions about what strength really looks like. Stay with us, because what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about healing divisions that run generations deep. Sometimes the most powerful responses to injustice come in forms we least expect. And sometimes the most important changes start not with a shout, but with a whisper that forces everyone to lean in and listen. To understand the weight of what happened that spring night, we need to step back 6 months earlier, to a community meeting in the oak-paneled conference room of the local police precinct. That's where our story's pivotal figure, the surgeon who would later shock the nation, first crossed paths with several of the officers who would eventually surround his son's car. He was there presenting a proposal for a medical mentorship program aimed at underserved youth, hoping to partner with the police department's community outreach division. The irony of that meeting wouldn't be lost on anyone who later watched the security footage from his son's arrest. In the grainy video, you can actually spot one of the officers who had enthusiastically supported his mentorship program just months before, now standing with his hand on his weapon as the teenager slowly exits his vehicle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That fall evening at the precinct, The surgeon had impressed everyone with his vision of creating pathways for local students to pursue careers in medicine. He spoke about growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, about the single teacher who changed his life by believing in his potential, about working nights at a gas station to put himself through pre-med. The officers in that room saw him as the embodiment of the American dream, proof that the system worked, that hard work and determination could lift anyone to success. What none of them knew then was how that same successful surgeon still got pulled over at least once every few months, usually while driving his luxury cars between hospital campuses. How he kept his hospital ID prominently displayed on his dashboard. How he had taught his son, from the age of 12, exactly what to do if law enforcement ever stopped him: hands visible, movements slow, voice steady and respectful no matter what. The mentorship program had launched successfully that winter. 15 high school students, selected from across the district, began shadowing medical professionals every other Saturday. The surgeon's son, despite his father's position, wasn't given one of those spots. Instead, he volunteered to help coordinate the program, handling paperwork and schedules, showing the same quiet competence that had earned him early acceptance to Stanford. The night of the incident began routinely enough. Volleyball practice had run late, the team was preparing for state championships, and the teenager had texted his parents that he'd grab dinner on his way home. His father was in surgery, his mother at a fundraising event for the hospital's new children's wing. The dashcam from the first patrol car shows the Mercedes making a complete stop at a four-way intersection, signaling properly before turning right. What happened next remains a matter of dispute. The official police report claims the vehicle made an erratic movement and appeared to match the description of a vehicle involved in a recent incident. Body camera footage, however, shows the Mercedes maintaining a steady speed and proper lane position. The recent incident would later be revealed to involve a different make and model of car entirely. When the first patrol car activated its lights, the teenager did exactly what his father had taught him. He turned on his interior lights. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, clearly visible. He pulled over immediately, though he was less than 2 blocks from home. The Ring camera footage from a nearby house captures his voice, steady and clear. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" That's when things escalated. Within 3 minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived. The teenager's polite questions about the reason for the stop were met with increasingly aggressive commands. Despite following every instruction precisely, he soon found himself standing spread-eagled against his car, his school ID and pristine driver's license lying on the ground where an officer had tossed them. After checking them, what the officers didn't know was that their suspect, the honor roll student, volleyball team captain, and hospital volunteer coordinator, had already been accepted into Stanford's pre-med program, following his father's footsteps. They didn't know that just that morning, he had helped a freshman teammate practice serves for 2 hours before school. They didn't know that his phone, sitting in plain view on the passenger seat, was repeatedly lighting up with texts from his mother, who was starting to worry about how long it was taking him to get home. But here's what they did know: they knew he was driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood. They knew, from running his license, that his address was in one of the most exclusive subdivisions in the area. They knew, from his polite responses and steady demeanor, that he was well educated and well raised. And yet something made them certain he didn't belong. The neighbor who began filming from her doorbell camera would later tell reporters she started recording because the scene felt wrong. There was this overwhelming police presence, she would explain, but this kid was so calm, so respectful, even as they were escalating things. I kept waiting for him to get frustrated, to show some attitude, but he never did. He just kept asking, very politely, why he had been stopped. As the situation unfolded, neither the officers nor the teenager knew that this neighbor's footage was being automatically uploaded to the cloud. They didn't know that within hours, it would reach the surgeon's colleagues at the hospital, then local community leaders, then national media outlets. They couldn't have predicted how this seemingly routine traffic stop would force their community to confront questions they'd long preferred to ignore. The teenager spent 47 minutes standing handcuffed by his car while officers searched the vehicle. They found exactly what you'd expect in a high school athlete's car: sports gear, textbooks, a half-empty water bottle, protein bar wrappers, and a folder full of mentorship program paperwork. What they didn't find was any justification for the stop, the search, or the handcuffs that were leaving marks on the wrists of a minor who had broken no laws. But it's what happened next after the handcuffs came off, after the teenager was finally allowed to pick up his license from the ground, after he drove the remaining blocks home with hands shaking so badly he had to pull over twice, that would truly set this story apart from similar incidents we've seen too many times before. The surgeon was just finishing a complex bypass procedure when his phone lit up with messages. By the time he changed out of his scrubs, the video had already been shared hundreds of times. His colleagues were gathered in the doctor's lounge, watching the footage in stunned silence. Many of them had known his son since he was a little boy, running through hospital hallways during holiday parties. They had watched him grow into the poised young man they now saw on screen, handling himself with a dignity that broke their hearts. The surgeon's response began taking shape even before he reached home, finding his son sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, still in his volleyball uniform, attempting to complete his calculus homework as if sticking to routine could somehow make the night's events less real. But it wasn't until the next morning, after a sleepless night spent holding his quietly crying wife and checking repeatedly on their finally sleeping son, that the surgeon made the decision that would transform this story from yet another viral video of injustice into something entirely unexpected. What happened next would challenge not just the local police department, but the entire community's understanding of accountability, forgiveness, and what true systemic change requires. The surgeon's approach would be criticized by some as too soft, by others as too demanding. But as we'll see in the next part of this story, he understood something crucial about breaking cycles of prejudice and pain, something that would prove more powerful than anyone could have predicted. As dawn broke that morning, while his son finally slept upstairs, the surgeon sat in his home office and began drafting a document. It wasn't the lawsuit everyone expected. It wasn't the public statement his lawyer was already preparing. It was something entirely different, something that would force everyone involved to look beyond their assumptions and defensive reactions to see a path forward none of them had considered. But before we reveal the contents of that document and its extraordinary impact, we need to understand the complex web of relationships, history, and competing pressures that would make the surgeon's response so revolutionary. We need to examine how a simple traffic stop exposed fault lines running deep beneath the surface of a community that prided itself on being progressive and inclusive. And we need to recognize how this father's unexpected choice would challenge everything we think we know about justice, healing, and the courage it takes to break free from expected narratives. The sun was rising over the hospital where the surgeon had spent countless hours saving lives, where he had earned the respect of colleagues who never saw him as anything but a brilliant physician, where he had built the reputation that gave weight to his words. In just a few hours, he would put that reputation on the line in a way that would leave everyone questioning their assumptions about power, privilege, and the true meaning of justice. As his son slept upstairs, still wearing his Stanford acceptance letter t-shirt, the surgeon wrote the first words of a document that would change not just his community, but become a blueprint for transformation in similar communities across the country. But to understand why his approach worked, and why it faced such initial resistance, we need to examine the complex dynamics at play in a community that thought it had moved beyond the very issues this incident would bring to light. The story continues to unfold through a series of unexpected turns, each one challenging our assumptions about accountability, forgiveness, and what it truly takes to heal deep-seated wounds. As we'll see in the next segment, sometimes the most powerful responses to injustice come from understanding that true change requires more than just punishment or protest. It requires the courage to imagine and walk a different path entirely. As morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, the surgeon's colleagues gathered in growing numbers around the conference room television. Local news was running the neighbors' footage on a loop, interspersed with clips of previous incidents from across the country. But something about this story felt different, perhaps because so many of them knew this family personally, had watched this young man grow up, had celebrated his Stanford acceptance just months earlier. The surgeon's reputation in the medical community was legendary, not just for his surgical skills, but for his ability to remain calm under pressure. They had seen him handle 12-hour surgeries, navigate medical crises, and save seemingly hopeless cases. But as they watched him walk into that conference room, still wearing his white coat from morning rounds, they saw something new in his expression, a complex mixture of pain, determination, and something else they couldn't quite identify. He had spent the early hours of the morning completing the document he began drafting at dawn. Now, he carried it in a plain manila envelope, along with a USB drive containing copies of all the videos, not just the viral footage, but security cameras from nearby homes, dashcam footage he had already obtained, and his son's own cell phone recording of the incident. But it wasn't these videos that would shock everyone. It was the contents of that envelope. Downtown, the police department was in crisis mode. The chief had called an emergency meeting with his command staff, legal team, and public relations officers. They had dealt with controversial incidents before, but this one was different. The surgeon wasn't just any prominent citizen, he was someone who had worked closely with the department, who had believed in them enough to partner with them on community programs. The irony was suffocating. Media trucks were already setting up outside the precinct. Social media was exploding with hashtags and calls for protests. Local community leaders were demanding immediate action. But in the midst of this growing storm, something unexpected was about to unfold. The surgeon's son sat in his first period AP physics class, despite his parents' suggestion that he take the day off. His teammates on the volleyball team formed a protective circle around him, glaring at anyone who dared stare too long or whisper too loudly. His phone kept buzzing with message notifications until he finally turned it off. He had woken up to find himself trending on social media, his story being shared by celebrities and activists nationwide. But all he wanted was to solve the equations on the whiteboard, to feel normal for just a few moments. Back at the hospital, the surgeon finished his morning procedures early. His colleagues watched as he changed out of his scrubs, put on his best suit, and gathered his materials. Nobody knew exactly what he planned to do, but they knew him well enough to recognize that look of quiet determination. This was the same expression he wore before attempting particularly challenging surgeries, the ones that required not just skill, but a kind of inspired vision to find solutions where others saw only impossibilities. At the police precinct, the chief's secretary received an unexpected call. The surgeon was requesting a meeting not next week, not tomorrow, but within the hour. He wasn't coming with lawyers or media or protesters. He was coming alone, with a single envelope and a proposal that would challenge everyone's assumptions about justice and accountability. The tension in the precinct's conference room was palpable as they waited for his arrival. The same officers who had enthusiastically supported his mentorship program just months ago now sat uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with each other. The chief had already reviewed the bodycam footage multiple times, each viewing revealing more problems with how the situation had been handled. But as the surgeon's car pulled into the parking lot, followed by a swarm of news crews he had somehow learned to evade, nobody in that building could have predicted what was about to unfold. The document in his manila envelope wasn't just a complaint or a lawsuit, it was something far more challenging, far more transformative, and far more controversial than anyone could have imagined. He walked through the precinct doors alone, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet hallway. Officers who normally patrolled the front desk found reasons to be elsewhere. The secretary, who had always greeted him warmly, now barely met his eyes as she directed him to the conference room. The chief stood as he entered, extending a hand that hung awkwardly in the air as the surgeon placed his envelope on the table instead of shaking it. The room was packed with department leadership, legal representatives, and community relations officers. They had prepared statements, explanations, and preliminary disciplinary actions to present. But before anyone could speak, the surgeon reached into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected: his hospital ID badge. What happened next would not only silence everyone in that room but would eventually challenge police departments and communities across the country to completely rethink their approach to accountability and transformation. The surgeon was about to propose something that would either bridge seemingly impossible divides or make them even wider, and nobody, not even his closest friends and colleagues, could have predicted which path this would take. As he began to speak, his voice steady and clear in the tense silence, he laid out a vision that would force everyone involved to step beyond their defensive positions and predetermined narratives. But to understand the full impact of what he proposed and why it would prove so controversial, we first need to examine the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that led to this moment. The next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this incident, but potentially the future of police-community relations in cities across America. As the surgeon opened that manila envelope, he was about to challenge everything people thought they knew about justice, accountability, and the true meaning of systemic change. The conference room fell silent as the surgeon placed his hospital ID badge on the table next to the manila envelope. In that moment, everyone assumed he was about to resign from the community outreach program, a symbolic gesture of protest that would make headlines and deepen the crisis. But then he did something that changed the entire dynamic of the room. He pulled out his son's Stanford acceptance letter and placed it beside his badge. "Before I show you what's in this envelope," he began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when explaining complex procedures to patients' families, "I need to tell you about something that happened at the hospital last night, while my son was being handcuffed outside his car." The police chief shifted uncomfortably, but the surgeon continued, his calm demeanor making his words even more impactful. "While those officers were running my son's license, I was in operating room 3, performing emergency surgery on Officer Michael Sullivan's father." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Officer Sullivan, one of the 3 officers involved in the traffic stop, felt the color drain from his face. His father had been rushed to the hospital the previous evening after a massive heart attack. The surgery hadn't been scheduled, it was an emergency procedure that could only be performed by a handful of surgeons in the state. "Mr. Sullivan flatlined twice on my table," the surgeon continued, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "Both times I brought him back. Not because he was a police officer's father, I didn't even know that until this morning. I did it because that's what we do in my profession. We don't see uniforms or backgrounds or assumptions. We see human beings." He opened the manila envelope, but instead of pulling out legal documents or formal complaints, he removed a series of photographs. The first showed him as a young medical student, being handcuffed on the side of a road. The second showed him in his surgical residency, standing against a police car. The third showed him in his current position as chief of cardiothoracic surgery, being questioned by campus security in the hospital parking lot. These incidents spanned 20 years, he explained, laying them out one by one. Different cities, different departments, same story. But here's what you don't see in these photos. He pulled out another set of images, pictures of him in operating rooms, saving lives. Some of the patients in the photos were police officers and their family members. The chief's phone buzzed with an urgent message. The hospital was holding a press conference. Initially, everyone assumed it would be to announce the surgeon's resignation or to condemn the police department. Instead, they were about to reveal something that would add another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. The surgeon's son, still sitting in his high school classroom, had no idea what his father was doing. He couldn't have known that at that exact moment. His college acceptance status was about to become part of a much larger story. Stanford's admission office had just released a statement, one that would force everyone to confront their biases in an even more uncomfortable way. But before the chief could process this new information, the surgeon reached back into his envelope and removed one final document. It wasn't a lawsuit, or a complaint, or even a letter of resignation. It was a proposal so unexpected, so challenging to everyone's assumptions, that it would force both the department and the community to question everything they thought they knew about addressing systemic bias. As news helicopters circled overhead and protesters began gathering outside, the surgeon laid out a plan that would either heal the deepest wounds in the community or tear it apart entirely. But just as he reached the crucial point in his presentation, an urgent knock on the conference room door interrupted him. The hospital's chief of staff needed him immediately. Officer Sullivan's father had taken a turn for the worse. In that moment, the surgeon had to make a choice that would define not just his response to injustice, but challenge everyone's understanding of duty, accountability, and the true meaning of systemic change. His next decision would either bridge impossible divides or deepen them beyond repair. The chief watched as the surgeon gathered his documents, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just heard. But before any decisions could be made, before any responses could be crafted, another video had surfaced, one that would force everyone involved to confront an even more uncomfortable truth about that night. As the surgeon rushed back to the hospital, his proposal left unfinished on the conference room table. Neither he nor the police officials could have anticipated how the next few hours would reshape not just their community's approach to bias and accountability, but potentially provide a blueprint for departments across the country grappling with similar issues. The story was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would test everyone's assumptions about justice, healing, and the true cost of transformative change. As the surgeon scrubbed in for another emergency procedure, his son sat in his AP Physics class, unaware that his father's actions were about to spark a national conversation about what real accountability looks like. But to understand the full impact of what was about to unfold, we need to examine the contents of that final document and the stunning revelation that was about to come from Stanford University. Because sometimes the most powerful responses to injustice come from places we least expect, and the true test of character lies not in avoiding difficult choices, but in how we face them when they're thrust upon us. The surgeon's scrubs were still damp with sweat from the emergency surgery when he walked back into the police department's conference room. Officer Sullivan's father would live, though the next 48 hours would be critical. The chief and his command staff had waited, the surgeon's unfinished proposal still spread across the table where he'd left it 3 hours earlier. But something had changed during those 3 hours. The new video had surfaced security footage from inside the hospital parking garage, taken 6 months earlier. It showed Officer Sullivan himself, out of uniform, being stopped by hospital security while visiting his father during a previous health scare. And there was the surgeon, still in his surgical gear, stepping in to defuse the situation, vouching for Sullivan without knowing he was a police officer. "I didn't recognize you last night," Sullivan spoke up as the surgeon settled back into his chair. His voice cracked slightly. "When we got the call about a suspicious vehicle, I didn't connect that address with the doctor who..." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. The surgeon nodded, then reached for his proposal. But before he could continue, the chief's phone lit up with an incoming video call. On the screen was the dean of admissions from Stanford University, joined by someone unexpected, the university's police chief. What they revealed next would transform this local incident into a national model for community transformation. Stanford wasn't just standing by their acceptance of the surgeon's son. They were offering something unprecedented, a new scholarship program, jointly funded by their medical school and criminal justice department. The program would pair pre-med students with law enforcement training initiatives, creating opportunities for future doctors and officers to train together, understanding each other's perspectives from the beginning of their careers. The surgeon's proposal to his local police department suddenly carried even more weight. He wasn't just suggesting accountability measures or diversity training. His plan centered on creating a permanent partnership between the hospital's residency program and police academy training. New officers would shadow doctors in emergency rooms, understanding split-second decisions made under pressure. Medical residents would ride along with patrol officers, learning about the complexities of street-level crisis response. But here's where the story takes its final unexpected turn. As the surgeon laid out the details of his proposal, his son was making a decision of his own. The teenager had just stood up in the middle of his AP physics class, asked to be excused, and walked directly to the police department. He didn't know about his father's meetings, about Stanford's announcement, or about Officer Sullivan's father. He just knew he couldn't sit quietly anymore. Walking into the police station lobby, the young man found himself face to face with the same officers who had handcuffed him the night before. The front desk fell silent. Then, with the same steady voice he'd used during the traffic stop, he made an announcement that would complete his father's vision in an unexpected way. He wanted to split his time at Stanford pre-med track and criminal justice studies. He wanted to become both a doctor and a reserve police officer, bridging the gap not just in theory but in practice. But first, he wanted to spend his remaining months before college working with the department's community outreach program, specifically with officers like Sullivan, turning this moment of crisis into an opportunity for real change. The security cameras in the lobby captured the moment when Officer Sullivan, still shaken from nearly losing his father and now confronting his own biases, stood up from behind the desk. What happened next would be replayed on news stations across the country not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it was quietly revolutionary. The young man extended his hand, not in forgiveness or submission, but in partnership. Sullivan removed his badge, placed it on the desk between them, and shook the teenager's hand as an equal. By the time the surgeon emerged from the conference room, his son and Sullivan were sitting in the lobby, already deep in conversation about how to reshape training programs for both future officers and doctors. Stanford's program would eventually spread to universities nationwide. The surgeon's hospital would become a model for community police partnerships. But perhaps the most profound change was the quietest the day, 3 years later, when the surgeon's son graduated from Stanford with dual honors in pre-med and criminal justice, with Officer Sullivan sitting in the audience next to the surgeon's family. The final twist in this story isn't about policies changed or programs implemented. It's about what happened the next time a teenage driver was pulled over in that same neighborhood. The officer who approached the car was one who had gone through the new joint training program. The way he handled the stop with empathy, professionalism, and awareness proved that transformed systems can transform outcomes. As we reflect on this story, it's worth noting that real change rarely comes from a single dramatic moment. It comes from people willing to see beyond their pain to possibilities, from communities brave enough to transform incidents of division into opportunities for connection. The surgeon and his son didn't just challenge a system, they helped build a new one. Today, that intersection where a teenager was once handcuffed is the site of a new community center, jointly operated by the hospital and police department. Inside, you'll find medical students and police cadets training together, learning from each other's perspectives, and building the foundation for a different kind of future. And if you look closely, you might spot a photo on the wall, a surgeon and his son, standing proudly with Officer Sullivan, at the center's opening ceremony. The true power of this story lies not in its ending, but in its ripple effects that continue to reshape communities across the country. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from tearing systems down, but from having the courage and vision to transform them from within. And sometimes the bravest response to injustice is not to demand change, but to become the change itself. 5 years after that pivotal traffic stop, the community center bustles with activity on a warm spring evening. Medical students in white coats mingle with police cadets in training uniforms, gathered for their weekly joint crisis response workshop. At the front of the room stands a familiar face, the surgeon's son, now in his final year of medical school, leading a session on rapid assessment and decision-making under pressure. The program that began as a response to injustice has evolved into something far more profound. Over 2,000 officers across the country have now completed similar training initiatives. Emergency rooms in major cities have adopted protocols developed through this partnership. But perhaps the most telling statistic isn't about numbers or policies, it's about relationships transformed. Officer Sullivan, now a training supervisor, often reflects on how close he came to being part of the problem rather than the solution. His father, fully recovered from his heart surgery, volunteers at the center, sharing his story with new recruits about how a moment of crisis became a catalyst for change. The surgeon still performs life-saving operations, but he also regularly speaks at police academies nationwide, helping departments rethink their approach to community relations. The neighbor who recorded the original video hasn't put her phone down, but now she documents different kinds of moments. Her social media channels showcase police officers and medical professionals working together, young people finding mentors in unexpected places, and communities healing through understanding. Her viral video of the traffic stop is still online, but it's now followed by years of updates showing what happened after, proving that even the darkest moments can lead to light. The Stanford program has expanded to 30 universities across the country. Each year, a new class of students graduates with dual expertise in medicine and law enforcement, creating a growing network of professionals who understand both worlds. The surgeon's son, set to complete his medical residency next year, has already been offered positions at several hospitals known for their innovative community policing partnerships. But perhaps the most powerful testament to change happened just last month. A teenage driver, nervous and scared during a traffic stop, mentioned that she hoped to become a doctor someday. The officer who pulled her over happened to be a graduate of the Joint Training Program. Instead of a ticket, she received an application for the community center's mentorship program. Next fall, she'll be starting pre-med classes at Stanford, her tuition covered by the same scholarship program that grew from this story. The original viral video still circulates occasionally on social media, but now it's shared as a beginning rather than an end, a moment when a community chose transformation over division, understanding over anger. The comments section, once filled with outrage, now fills with stories of similar programs starting in other cities, of lives changed and perspectives shifted. The surgeon still keeps his hospital ID badge next to his son's Stanford acceptance letter, framed together in his office. They serve as reminders that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't to tear systems down, but to transform them from within. His son's dual graduation photos, white coat and police academy uniform, hang beside them, symbols of bridges built and barriers broken. When people ask what made this program succeed where others failed, the answer always comes back to that crucial decision, the choice to see beyond the immediate moment of crisis to possibilities for lasting change. The surgeon and his son didn't just demand different behavior, they helped create new systems that made better behavior possible. As this story continues to inspire similar initiatives nationwide, its legacy isn't just in programs created or policies changed. It's in the everyday moments: a medical student and police cadet studying together, a teenager finding mentorship instead of confrontation, a community discovering that its strongest bonds often grow from its deepest wounds. Looking back, that spring night could have become just another viral video, just another moment of division. Instead, it became proof that when we're brave enough to imagine different outcomes, when we're willing to build new bridges instead of burning old ones, transformation isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The surgeon's son still drives past that intersection every day on his way to the hospital. The street looks the same, but everything else has changed. And perhaps that's the most powerful lesson from this story. Real change doesn't always shout, sometimes it simply shows up, day after day, in the quieter moments when people choose to see each other differently, to learn from each other genuinely, and to build something new together.